The Chicago Bears addressed the biggest needs on their roster with some significant investments in the offensive and defensive lines. But that doesn't mean there aren't more holes to fill and more work to be done in free agency.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. On the show today, I want to take a look at what work still lies ahead for the Bears in free agency after all the moves we saw, mostly on Monday, but also the trades leading up to the start of free agency, the roster holes that still need to be filled. This is it's half an exercise in ranking the remaining needs on the roster, but then also looking at what kind of options are still available for the Bears at those positions. Understanding that, as we record this podcast, these players are still available, but free agency moves fast and furious. And maybe by the time you're listening to this podcast, one or more of the players we talk about on the podcast today won't still be available, but that's the nature of the beast here. And at least some of the names we talk about, we got multiple names at every spot. So hopefully at least a few of these guys stick it out here, or maybe heck, by the time you listen to this, the Bears may sign a player like this as well. So as always with these free agency time period podcasts, I hope that you can give us a little bit of grace here as things move faster than we can keep up with in the daily podcast world. But I think it's pretty clear and obvious that O-line and D-line were the biggest needs the Bears needed to address in free agency, and Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson made that a very clear priority. With the trades for Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson, the signing of Drew Dahlman, and then on the defensive line, the signings of Dayo Odengbo and Grady Jarrett, pretty clearly hammered home those spots, and the dollars invested in them kind of signify how important it was for the Bears to make those moves. From there, though, there's still more work to be done, and I think when you start to look at like what's next most important, I think I look at this from the perspective of, okay, like if the season started today, or if training camp started today, right? Like where would be the biggest concerns, the biggest holes, the biggest spots that like still most desperately need to be addressed? And it kind of comes full circle for me that I think the next biggest need now remaining on the roster is actually wide receiver at this point. Yes, you've got DJ Moore and Rome Odunze, but your number 3 wide receiver right now is Tyler Scott, your 4th-round pick from a couple of seasons ago, who has like 18 career catches for 170 yards or whatever in 2 seasons. This is not a player who's ready to be the number 3 wide receiver in your offense. And the number 3 receiver in Ben Johnson's Lions offense is essentially a starter. That player is going to play more than 50% of the snaps in your offensive packages here. This is going to be a very key, critical player in your rotation. It doesn't have to be a 1,000-yard caliber guy like Keenan Allen. Ben Johnson never really invested super heavily in that position as like making it a priority to get a big name number 3 wide receiver, but it does need to be somebody who's a little bit more proven and talented than Tyler Scott. You don't have to be giving up on Tyler Scott, but you can have Tyler Scott stick around without forcing him into the number 3 wide receiver role here. Because beyond him, under contract right now, you've got guys from the practice squad last year. Samori Toure, John Jackson, and then Maurice Alexander is a guy they brought in on a futures contract who had been a practice squad guy with the Lions that Ben Johnson seems to have liked. But really, those are all training camp body guys. You have 3 NFL wide receivers on your roster. You're going to need to add at least 2 more at that position in addition to all the other guys they still have under contract. So when I look at free agent options still available, there are plenty of guys that fit this bill where they won't be so expensive that the Bears struggle to afford them under the salary cap, but they're not just, veteran minimum players who aren't much better than Tyler Scott. Like real upgrades that shouldn't be real expensive, including some former Detroit Lions wide receivers. Tim Patrick is a name we've talked about a lot this offseason, and he's still available as a free agent as the Lions' number 3 receiver from last year. Or 2 years ago, they had Josh Reynolds in Ben Johnson's offense as one of their rotational wide receivers in there. He spent last season with the Jacksonville Jaguars, also working with Bears passing game coordinator Press Taylor. I believe he was a cap casualty for them this offseason. So Josh Reynolds would make a lot of sense coming to Chicago. Or another former Jaguar, Devin Duvernay, has some kick return upside that I think would make a lot of sense. A couple of former Kansas City Chiefs that worked with running backs coach Eric Bieniemy when he was offensive coordinator there, and some ties back to when Ryan Poles was with the Chiefs, with Juju Smith-Schuster, and then Demarcus Robinson, who played for the Rams this past season but was a Chief before that. Those guys would both make a lot of sense and shouldn't be crazy expensive either. So, I think any of those guys we mentioned, Reynolds, Patrick, Duvernay, Smith-Schuster, Robinson, you could throw in DJ Chark from the Chargers. Any of those guys would make a lot of sense and wouldn't cost a ton of money at this stage of the process. You're going to have to, wait this out in free agency. I don't think these are signings that happen tomorrow, but I do think they kind of fit the right price and the right need for the Bears, and it would be a good opportunity for them to come to Chicago where they could be a number 3, still get a lot of playing time, but not have to be the guy and not get a ton of attention from opposing defenses, and maybe be able to carve out a nice little role for them in this Bears offense. I think the same type of position exists on defense, where, maybe it's not a traditional starter, but someone who's going to play a lot and have a starting role. The next biggest need for me after wide receiver is the number 3 defensive end. You signed Dayo Odeyingbo from the Indianapolis Colts to be the starter opposite Montez Sweat, but you still need that one more pass rusher in that edge rotation here. Because much like wide receiver, you have a young guy in that spot right now, but he's not ready for that role. As it stands right now, Austin Booker, your 5th-round pick from last season, is really set up as that number 3 defensive end. You've got Dominic Robinson and Daniel Hardy under contract, but I don't know that either one of them makes the 53-man roster. Hardy is a special teams player maybe, but those guys are not number 3 pass rushers. So right now it would be Austin Booker, who had 1.5 sacks last season, flashed a little bit in there, but realistically, Booker was on the field for fewer than 300 snaps for his rookie season. As much as there's a lot of upside there and a lot to like about Austin Booker, he's not ready to be the true number 3 defensive end. That's a player that's going to play, 500 to 700 snaps in a rotation out there, and someone you need to get a handful of sacks out of. The Bears need to add something else, even if it's just equal competition so Booker and this guy can compete, or you want to get a bona fide veteran upgrade there. You want to add to this pass rush to just keep adding more talent and bodies that can rotate in and keep everyone fresh there. There's some familiar names there, some outside names, a lot of pass rushers still available on the market, again, at the time I'm recording this. But I think about somebody like DeMarcus Lawrence from the Cowboys as a veteran. If his market kind of dries up a little bit, he could be somebody that would be fun to see come in. Or a player the Bears tried to trade for last preseason who's available now, Matthew Judon, was traded to the Patriots from the Falcons and was okay, but price tag's going to be a heck of a lot lower after a disappointing season. That would be a name to watch there. Draymond Jones from the Seattle Seahawks was a salary cap casualty for them. Someone who played defensive tackle in the past. The Seahawks moved him to the edge. He could be a bigger DeMarcus Walker-like edge rusher for the Bears where he could play on the outside and the inside and give you some good versatile depth there. I think any of those 3 guys would be huge upgrades for the Bears. Or if they want to go a little lower and a little cheaper because they just put a bunch of money into Odeyingbo, somebody like Zadarius Smith from the Lions, who worked with Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn last season in Detroit. He could complete the NFC North tour. He's played for the Packers, Vikings, and Lions now. Why not finish it out with the Chicago Bears? Or somebody like Tano Passino from the Saints was one of their rotational defensive ends under Dennis Allen. I think he would make a lot of sense as a veteran to bring in here too. So there's 4 or 5 different quality defensive ends. There's 4 or 5 different quality wide receivers that you can find one that won't cost you, 7 figures on a contract, but can still give you better production than the young players the Bears have at that spot that you want to develop, but not necessarily thrust into such large roles. Those to me are kind of the biggest, slow-hanging fruit needs that you'd like to see the Chicago Bears address in free agency. Everything else, you can wait to the draft a little bit to try and fill some of these spots, but there's still names to like at a number of different spots where it's if the right opportunity presents itself, I want to see the Bears fill even more with cheaper free agents in the open market. We'll take a look into some of those spots on both sides of the ball next on Locked On Bears. This show is sponsored by Betterhelp. Taking care of your mental health can feel like a big investment, but it's just as important as taking care of your body. Whether, you spend money on a membership to the gym, you spend money on eating healthy food. So why not invest in your mental well-being as well? Our friends at Betterhelp offer a flat fee for weekly online therapy sessions, making professional support more accessible and affordable. With over 30,000 therapists and over 5 million people helped, it's the world's largest online therapy platform. I do therapy online, and it's a really important part of my own personal mental health regimen. And that's why it's important to take time for yourself and learn the necessary coping skills and setting boundaries with BetterHelp. You don't have to be going through a major crisis to benefit from therapy. Sometimes it's just about having someone to talk to. Your well-being is worth it. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's 10% off your first month at betterhelp, HELP.com/lockedon. We heard at the NFL Combine, Ben Johnson talked about, rebuilding this Bears offensive line. And, he was asked about, can you get 3 new interior starters all in one offseason? And he said, yeah, absolutely. And look, less than a month later, here we are, 3 new starters on the interior. So what Ben Johnson says goes in terms of getting the offensive line pieces he wants and prioritizing that position. And one of the other things he said in that same press conference at the Combine, he talked about how it's not just about having 5 good linemen, but in the NFL, you have linemen suffer injuries. And I don't know that any team had the same 5 starting offensive linemen in every single game last season. Every team is going to have a lineman miss at least one game. And recent Chicago Bears history should show us that you're going to have at least one lineman likely miss multiple games, significant time. You could have multiple linemen missing multiple games. And what Ben Johnson said is you don't just need 5 good linemen. You need 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 good linemen to be able to rely on. Now, 10's probably pushing it a little bit there, but you want to make sure that you have somebody you really trust to play backup offensive tackle, maybe either spot, the swing tackle, backup guard, either spot, the swing guard, and backup center, right? You want at least and I guess that backup guard / center could be the same person. In theory, you could say Ryan Bates is the player you trust to be the backup guard or center, but you still need to make sure you really trust your backup tackle. And is that Karan Amagaji? I'm not sure that we saw enough from Karan Amagaji yet to say, yes, he is for sure the guy that you feel really comfortable with if you have an injury at either tackle spot, throwing him in there. So I think at a minimum, the Bears need to add another offensive tackle that can be a backup rotational player in there that is probably ultimately ahead of Karan Amagaji while you continue to develop Amagaji on the depth chart. And I wouldn't mind bringing in another guard you trust a bit more as well, because maybe Ryan Bates can fill in at guard or center, but if you happen to be injured with both, then do you go to Bill Murray? The Bears don't have a lot of depth on the offensive line right now as far as guys currently under contract. Your starting 5 looks great. You got Amagaji, Murray, and Bates, and then a bunch of offseason signing camp bodies, like the return of Hard Knocks star Theo Benedette. They signed Jordan McFadden from the Chargers. Ricky Stromberg is a center who played a little bit for the Commanders in the past. They got some camp body guys, but you don't have much else. And I would prefer another guard to compete and potentially push Bill Murray, and another tackle to compete and potentially push Karan Amagaji there. Not that you're just instantly writing off Amagaji or Bill Murray. I think both of those players are still developing and can be good NFL players, but I don't want to go into the season necessarily trusting to say, yes, these guys are for sure bona fide, sure thing studs as backup offensive linemen. I'd like to get some more in there. And I think there's some options in free agency that, again, we're talking backup offensive linemen here, so it's not sexy, but somebody like Andrus Peat, who would make a lot of sense for me, because Pete was a former first-round pick by Dennis Allen's New Orleans Saints, with offensive line coach Dan Rochar coaching him for, what I think, 9 seasons in New Orleans, 3 Pro Bowls. He's now a backup, spent the last season with the Raiders, but he can play tackle and he can play guard. He's played at both spots in his career, and that would make a lot of sense to me as a veteran with good experience, still can play at a decently high level, positional versatility, tackle or guard, knows your offensive line coach, knows Declan Doyle, knows the coaches on this Bears team already. And I just think, to me, it makes a whole heck of a lot of sense to bring in someone like Andrus Peat, who's likely not going to cost very much because he was a backup all of last season anyway. I also wouldn't rule out the possibility that as the free agent market continues, and if it dries up a little bit, some of the older veterans we talked about this offseason, I wonder if the starting opportunities may ultimately not end up being there for them. Like most likely, Kevin Zeitler from the Lions finds a starting job somewhere else. And most likely Brandon Scherf from the Jacksonville Jaguars finds a starting job somewhere else. But say 2 weeks go by in free agency and those starting opportunities aren't really there for them. Would either of them consider, you know what, okay, maybe at this stage of my career, I'm just not a starter anymore. Kevin Zeitler just turned 35, and maybe that's around the age when some lineman who, if you're not a Pro Bowl caliber guy like Trent Williams in San Francisco, like maybe that's ultimately when you start to transition to that new role a little bit. Scherf is only 33, so in theory, he still has a lot more left in the tank. But if the market dries up, could they look at Chicago and say, man, like Jonah Jackson has a lot of injury history, maybe I'll go there and be a backup there? Probably not, but I don't want to rule it out as a possibility if they just feel like, man, it's a better opportunity than anything they're seeing anywhere else. But maybe they'll sign a starter somewhere else. It's only day 2 of free agency as we're recording this podcast. But other backups out there, like Nick Gates from the Philadelphia Eagles, was a starting center for the Commanders 2 years ago when Eric Bieniemy was the offensive coordinator. He would make some sense here. And dare I throw out the name Lucas Patrick, a reunion to Chicago, because he spent the last couple seasons in New Orleans with Bears offensive line coach Dan Ruchar was there for, not this past season, but the year before that with him on the Saints there. So I wonder if there's a connection there where, you can find a reunion as something that you might want to see for the Bears. I'm not saying I would love it, but honestly, I'd rather just re-sign somebody like Matt Pryor, who was a nice backup fit for the Bears, who started a bunch of games this past season, but you don't want him to have to be your starter, but he can play guard or tackle. Like that to me would be the easiest thing that makes the most sense. Like him or Andres Pete is kind of where I would bet my money at this point. But give me more better backup offensive linemen, and I could feel a lot better about the depth in addition to the starting caliber group that the Bears have here. Then I move to a position like tight end, where Ryan Poles signed former Miami Dolphin Durham Smythe to be the number 2 tight end on the depth chart. The Bears also have a couple of camp bodies at that position, but not necessarily there's not really a true number 3. And honestly, I'd almost prefer Smythe as a number 3 if you could go get a better number 2. The problem is the tight end market is really light. There's some names at the top like Evan Ingram from the Jaguars or Tyler Conklin from the Jets that, might be more than the Bears want to pay at the tight end spot, or maybe something like Mo Alley Cox could fit in that small window, but there's not a lot of good options at tight end. I'm curious to see how the Bears end up approaching that position moving forward. And then linebacker, with Jack Sanborn currently an unrestricted free agent, the Bears don't necessarily have that ideal starter in base defense next to Edwards and Edmonds. Under contract, you have, you re-signed Amon Ogbongbemiga, more of a special teams player. They have Noah Sewell, their 5th-round pick from 2 years ago, and maybe they just think Sewell is ready to step into that third linebacker job. It's a starter, but only in base defense, so he'll only play 25% of the time or whatever. And they got a couple of former undrafted free agent guys farther down the depth chart, but I just wonder if one more veteran, cheap linebacker addition isn't in the works here, especially because there's some guys in free agency that have some familiarity with Bears coaches and even executives in the case of Ryan Poles. I look at the linebacker market, some quick names I'll throw out there. Grant Stewart from the Indianapolis Colts. The Bears hired the Colts linebackers coach. He'd worked with him for the last 3 or 4 seasons in Indianapolis as kind of a spot starter. I think this kind of role would make a lot of sense for him. I look at Willie Gay from the New Orleans Saints. Spent last season with Dennis Allen briefly on the Saints, but prior to that was with the Chiefs. And Ryan Poles was there when the Chiefs first acquired Willie Gay, more of a veteran, kind of sometimes like half-season starter, spot starter for them in New Orleans. Nick Vigil from Dallas is in a similar role there. He's bounced around the league, but he was with Al Harris in Dallas last season. Or Ben Neiman from the Detroit Lions with the Ben Johnson connection, and then also he was a former Chiefs acquisition under Poles as well here. So between those guys, any of those guys should be, less than $5 million a year, special teams player who can be a starter, but can really just be that Jack Sanborn role, or just re-sign Jack Sanborn. But one way or the other, it feels like the Bears need to do something just a little bit extra at linebacker. Those are all the real holes. But then I think there's a couple spots that are still luxury positions where it's if you found some cap space, or maybe you think about it as a first-round pick in the draft, like if you had some extra room to invest in a spot, it'd be nice to add something in a couple other spots, but not something you necessarily have to do. So I want to take a look at a couple of the primary luxury positions for the Bears that might be better fits for the NFL draft than free agency, but still some free agent names to keep an eye on. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. Whether you want to ride with some underdogs on your bracket or take the favorites all the way to the Final Four, it makes it super easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. You can even look ahead to the NFL draft and bet on who's going to be the first wide receiver taken, who's going to be the number one overall pick, and so much more. All in the FanDuel app that's safe and simple to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around. With tournament games happening almost every day, there's almost always something exciting to bet on with FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com for your chance to win $200 in bonus bets and get in on all the college hoops action all tournament long. We went through the positions I think that are still like big holes where it's like if you started the season tomorrow, you wouldn't have exactly enough of what you need there. But there's a couple spots where it's like, yeah, you've got enough to get by, but if the opportunity presented itself, the right opportunity to make an upgrade at the position, you wouldn't necessarily bat an eye on, oh yeah, like it'd be nice to get more talent at that spot. And the two big ones here that we're going to end up talking about a lot for the Bears' first round pick are left tackle and running back. And certainly I think the draft would be the preferable place to upgrade those spots because most players that you would look at being an upgrade in free agency are likely going to cost more than the Bears want to spend. And honestly, just like more than the cap space that they have right now. Because one of the things I'm interested in hearing from Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson at their press conference on Wednesday is like the Bears cap space after the two trades for the guards was somewhere between $37 and $43 million, depending on where you look, around that range. But the three contracts they signed in Dahlman, Odengbo, and Grady Jarrett average out to over like $47 million a year. So like they will almost certainly have to backload those contracts so that the year one salary cap hits are lower than that. But Poles may also need to create a little bit more cap space by restructuring a contract here or there, or maybe even making another salary cap casualty somewhere on the roster, whatever it may end up being. I'm curious to see how the Bears work this all financially because there's not a lot of money left to sign, certainly any big free agent contracts. And most of the deals the Bears have to sign from here will generally be cheaper, closer to veteran minimum, and certainly, not approaching seven figures. So that being said, like when I look at like left tackle options, right? Like the best tackle available as I'm recording this still is Cam Robinson, who spent this past season with the with the Vikings, but had previously been with the Jacksonville Jaguars. Like he's going to cost $20+ million, presumably. And the Bears don't have $20+ million in cap space right now to sign someone like Cam Robinson. If you wanted a veteran upgrade, like, Tyron Smith from the Jets, who had spent a lot of time with the Cowboys, he's like 34, 35, but like, I guess, but right, there's really not this like perfect sweet spot option unless you take a flyer on someone like Jedrick Willis from the Cleveland Browns, who was what I think a first round pick for them a number of years ago, but he's had injuries the last couple of seasons that really have derailed him. But he was a top 10 pick out of Alabama for them and played well for his first few seasons, but played 8 games in 2023 and 5 games in 2024. Like he's been injured, so he'll be cheap. So, you could bring him in and compete. And if he still has injury problems, Braxton Jones is still your guy. Like that's the one free agent that I think could make some sense. But at that point, like you're just going to have Krana Magaji compete with him or maybe wait for a rookie in the draft. That feels maybe a little bit more likely there. Running back, on the other hand, I think you can find some good value that fit where the Bears are financially. And also like, you can still find a player that is not going to be like a head and shoulders upgrade over DeAndre Swift, but someone who can be a factor in this rotation and not just a purely special teams playing number 3 running back. Because right now your only running backs under contract on your roster are DeAndre Swift, Roschon Johnson, and then last year's undrafted rookie free agent Ian Wheeler, who we liked a lot in the preseason, but I don't think the Bears are going to go into training camp handing Ian Wheeler the number 3 running back job. They're going to bring in somebody, some kind of competition there. And certainly that could be in the NFL draft. It could be a free agent. It could be a combination of both of those things. But some free agent running backs with some really clear and obvious ties to the Bears here. Jamal Williams, released by the New Orleans Saints, and spent a bunch of time in Detroit with Ben Johnson. You've got the Saints connections, the Lions connections. He should be very cheap. He was released. His previous contract was like $4 million, so he's certainly going to make less than that. Will probably be close to a veteran minimum player, given how much he kind of dropped off this past season. But you're not bringing him in and asking him to rush for 14 touchdowns and 1,000 yards. He asking him to rotate in with Swift and Roschon Johnson, and I think that could be a much more approachable role here that might make a signing like that make sense. Or if you want another player to upgrade you in the passing game a little bit, someone like Kareem Hunt from the Kansas City Chiefs, with the Eric Bieniemy connections as offensive coordinator, with the Ryan Poles connections, with bringing him into Kansas City. There's a lot of football reasons why that could make sense, even though I still think the Bears would like to steer clear of anybody with the kind of domestic violence and other legal history that Kareem Hunt brings with him. He's not a player that you necessarily want to bring into your locker room, into your organization, into your culture. It sends a questionable message, especially to the female fans of the Chicago Bears, and really every fan of the Chicago Bears should not be tolerating the kind of behavior Kareem Hunt has allegedly committed in the past. One more name we'll throw out. Dearness Johnson from the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's always been kind of a number 3 running back who would make a lot of sense here. Worked with Press Taylor in Jacksonville. There's some connections there. He's a veteran in that role. If they really want to swing for like more of an upgrade, like a 1,000-yard kind of guy, maybe Rico Dowdle from the Dallas Cowboys is kind of the best younger option still available. But again, I don't think they want to pay another big running back contract if they just gave one to DeAndre Swift. To me, it's a cheaper number 3 running back or the draft. Ashton Genty, Hampton from North Carolina, I can't think of his first name, or either of the Ohio State running backs, Caleb Johnson from Iowa. There's a lot of running back options to like in this draft, even if it's not with that first round pick. And we'll have plenty of time throughout this process to go into the draft running backs. We will talk about them because I think the Bears should draft a running back. I don't think it should be with the 10th overall pick. I don't think Ashton Genty will even be there when the Bears are on the clock with the 10th overall pick. But even if he is, I don't like the idea of using that pick at that position. But somewhere else in the draft, I think running back is definitely going to be in the mix. So I want to break down some running back prospects coming up here on the podcast. We'll go through some offensive line prospects. We'll get you all ready for the NFL draft once free agency fully slows down. But I also want to talk to Aaron Freeman from Locked On Falcons to kind of get the local scoop on Drew Dahlman and Grady Jarrett coming in as free agents. Hoping to make that happen later this week. And we'll talk to our friends from Locked On Colts about Dayo Odengbo. And we'll talk to our other Locked On Podcast Network hosts about all of the Bears' future free agent signings still to come, because their work is far from done. More signings are in the mix, and we will be breaking them all down for you right here on Locked On Bears. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Tomorrow, we will hear from Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles as they have their first press conference following the trades and the free agent signings. We'll bring you everything you need to know from that press conference with some quotes and clips and everything we learn from the direction of the new Bears regime. So make sure you make Locked On Bears your first listen once again tomorrow. We're all part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Don't forget, we got all of your favorite teams covered with Locked On NBA podcasts, MLB, NHL, and college sports. We've got all of your favorite non-Bears teams. So go take a listen to one of those for your second listen. Coming back tomorrow, make Locked On Bears your first listen once again for another opportunity to bear down.